studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Tuesday, December 23rd, 2014. As the cyber battle between North Korea and the U.S. rages over Sony's film The Interview, we'll examine race and gender representation in Hollywood in light of the revelations from Sony's leaked communications with my guest, Darnell Hunt. He is the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
A white police officer in Milwaukee will not be charged in the fatal shooting death of an unarmed black man in what has become a familiar script in police relations across the nation. Officer Christopher Manny shot 31-year-old Dontre Hamilton in April. Hamilton suffered from mental illness, including schizophrenia. Milwaukee County DA John Chisholm said on Monday that Manny acted in self-defense. Meanwhile, giving in to police pressure in the wake of the shooting deaths of two NYPD officers this weekend, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has called for a break in anti-police brutality protests until after the funerals of the two officers. De Blasio met with the families of the slain officers and said, quote, "It's so hard to make sense of it how one deeply troubled, violent individual could do this to these good families." Activists have fired back, saying they will not pause in their protests. Now, Bob, given the effect of war that police seem to have declared on Black America, how can they justify asking people to stop protesting? And do we ever see politicians pander like this to the families of police victims?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the metaphor of a war on Black America is the most accurate or the most helpful. I don't think of this as police officers engaged in a war on a specific community. We have a problem in policing in the way we ask our police agencies to interact with the public, and that focuses on the most vulnerable and the most oppressed, which of course is often Black America. But it's really more, I think, a more general crisis of policing. And unfortunately, in New York, this is denigrated into a question of is one for or against the police, instead of asking as a society, when we send police out into the community and create the conditions under which these situations escalate, how are we helping? And the point is we're not.
North Korea's tiny internet system has apparently been restored after a 10-hour shutdown. The system was targeted by a denial of service attack, clearly suggesting a malicious external hack. Internet service in North Korea is extremely limited, with just over 1,000 web addresses accessible only to the country's elite. Taking the system down would require little effort. The outage comes in the middle of an ongoing battle between the U.S. and North Korea over the hacking of Sony Entertainment Studios and its new film, The Interview. The Daily Beast, speculating that the U.S. government might possibly have been behind knocking North Korea's internet offline, said, quote, "Any retaliation by the U.S. government for the Sony hack would be significantly constrained by some very tricky and nuanced aspects of international law. Hacking the computers of an American company and stealing and erasing confidential information likely doesn't rise to the level of an armed attack against the United States," end of quote. Now, Bob, how serious a battle could this turn into? North Korea is a very small country, which has been relentlessly pushed around by the U.S. and, of course, by Hollywood.
Yeah, well, the first thing we should always ask is, when the U.S. engages in activities, how would we feel if those same activities were directed against the U.S.? If North Korea knocked out the U.S. internet service for the better part of the day, of course, we would go ballistic in this country. I think your point is well taken that, North Korea is a casualty of the Cold War. The reality of the geopolitical history there is that the United States was willing to sacrifice people in other parts of the world for Cold War politics. And North Korea is kind of the last lingering place where we see the horror of that. I think that, as is always the case, the U.S. public has to realize there's a history to this question. It didn't just start yesterday.
Right. And finally, a retired naval officer has taken it upon himself to sue the producers of Citizen4, the acclaimed documentary by Laura Poitras, which is based on the historic encounter between journalists and NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Claiming to represent the American public, Horace Edwards' lawsuit accuses Poitras and others from, quote, profiteering off of the theft and misuse of the NSA's blueprints for spying on the American public. The suit was filed in a federal court in Kansas and also describes those involved as people, quote, pretending to be journalists and whistleblowers, but in effect are evading the country and betraying their country. Now, I'm not sure just how rich Laura Poitras has gotten off of the film, Bob. She's an independent filmmaker, after all. Still, what do you make of this lawsuit?
Well, Sonali, you know from direct experience that independent journalists are fabulously wealthy, so that's well known. This is a lawsuit that, of course, isn't serious in legal terms. Remember, in the United States, anybody can sue anybody for anything. I'm thinking of suing Uprising for not making me more attractive on Skype, for instance. But the real question, of course, is this goes to this split in the United States between people who, when presented with evidence of governmental misbehavior, identify with the government, as opposed to those of us who, when presented with that same evidence, want to critique and reform the government. And so I think as a legal issue, this is trivial and silly, but as a social question, as a deep political rift in the U.S., I think it tells us a lot.
Well, Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll send our hair and makeup person over to you in Texas there for next week. Robert Jensen.
Don't worry, it won't do any good. Thanks.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's also a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. When we come back, Darnell Hunt joins us in studio for the hour. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion on diversity in Hollywood, not just representation of women and people of color, but stereotypes. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. President Obama this weekend said in an interview that the U.S. government may return North Korea to its list of state sponsors of terrorism over the Sony hacking scandal. In late November, about 100 terabytes of data were stolen from Sony's computer servers by a group calling itself Guardians of Peace. The group began releasing bits of information, including whole films, some in theaters and some as yet unreleased, onto the internet. It also released incriminating email exchanges between top Sony executives, Scott Rudin, Amy Pascal, Michael Linton, and others, exposing racist attitudes. Eventually, it became known that the hack was in response to the planned release of a Sony comedy starring Seth Rogen and James Franco, called The Interview, whose premise is a fictional assassination attempt against North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The hackers warned of terrorist attacks against theaters screening the film, leading a chain reaction of cancellations of the film to occur. The film is currently indefinitely shelved. In addition to the massive damage to Sony, both financially and to its reputation, the hack has exposed once more the inner workings of a major media company and its influence on race and racism in Hollywood. The movie industry has historically been guilty of playing up racist and sexist stereotypes and of grossly underrepresenting people of color and women. That trend continues today despite some measure of positive changes. Pop culture defines how we as a society view one another. It informs our implicit biases of each other. And it can remain far behind the times as the hue of our society continues to diversify, while our TV and movie screens remain the domain largely of straight white men. Joining us for the hour to discuss all these issues and more is Darnell Hunt. He's a professor of sociology and the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, which issues a report regularly examining diversity in Hollywood. Welcome to Uprising, Darnell.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first let's talk about the movie at issue here, The Interview, this particular movie that's at the heart of the North Korea Sony hacking scandal. Now, obviously haven't seen it. I tried to watch some trailers online. One of the things that strikes me immediately that going after Kim Jong-un is an easy target, and the cult of personality around him has already made him the butt of jokes. But the other thing that struck me was that, as usual, the protagonists in this film are a couple of white guys. And that's just completely out of, completely not out of the ordinary. That's how all films are, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a white-dominated industry, and it's white men that dominate the industry, so typically the stories are told from their perspective. So I'm not surprised that when this particular story, this film was made, that white men were the protagonists, so yeah.
Right. Now, one commentator named Maxine Builder wrote, "The real problem with the interview is its racism, not its satire." She said, quote, "Many of the jokes in the interview are at the expense of well-worn Asian stereotypes, and the movie's humor relies heavily on one-dimensional depictions of Asians that abound in American media that add little to the satire itself." I mean, it seems as though it's still completely politically acceptable to play up Asian stereotypes in films.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately. Stereotypes become sort of the stock and trade of the industry all too often, unfortunately. And again, when you have an industry that's dominated by whites, typically the jokes are always at the expense of underrepresented minorities, in some cases women, basically people who aren't in the position to make the decisions in the industry.
And I want to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about this sort of standard Asian stereotypes, but let's turn to the internal attitudes of Sony executives that were revealed in the email exchanges that were leaked. First, there were the emails between Amy Pascal and Scott Rudin, where they joked about President Obama's favorite movies. They were all movies with the certain theme, 12 Years a Slave, Django Unchained. I mean, of course, this was done in confidence, and these folks never expected to be overheard, but how revealing was this exchange to you?
It was very revealing. I wasn't surprised when I heard it. In fact, in some way, it was sort of confirmatory. I mean, it was sort of, confirming of the culture that clearly holds sway in the industry. We live in a society where, we say certain things in public. I mean, in 2014, it's not appropriate to openly mouth sexist, racist, homophobic comments. People tend to be more careful. Doesn't mean that they don't secretly harbor those feelings. And often, behind closed doors, they'll say this or that. Well, what we got a glimpse of with Sony was kind of what goes on behind closed doors, what executives typically say. And this is not just about Sony. For me, this is really about the broader industry. And I think we got a sense of what actually goes on, what the conventional wisdom is, what the typical thinking is in terms of what audiences want to see.
Or what they think audiences want.
What they think audiences want to see, what's viable, what they think is viable, that type of thing. And unfortunately, that defines and explains a lot of why we're seeing the stats we see today about the exclusion of women and people of color in the industry.
I mean, I think it was the conversation where they joked about the president's favorite movies is only something that would have been possible between two white executives at a major company. I mean, if one of them had been a person of color, I highly doubt that they would be making these jokes, or it just would have been less likely.
It would have been less likely, and even if the joke had come up, which probably does happen, the person of color or the woman, depending upon the nature of the joke, probably would have intervened and cut it short or made light of it, or at least made clear that this is not okay, it's not appropriate.
Right. Of course, there was a woman involved in this case, Amy Pascal.
Right. The joke wasn't about women, but in the case, if it had been, she may have taken a different position.
Now, one of the very few women of color writers, directors, and producers in Hollywood, Shonda Rhimes, said on her Twitter feed in response to the media coverage of Pascal and Rudin in their comments, she said, "Calling Sony comments racially insensitive remarks instead of racist, ? You can put a cherry on a pile of crap, but it don't make a sundae." And I'm paraphrasing crap. She used a more strong term. How important is it for someone of Rhimes' stature to speak up? And do you agree with her, by the way?
Absolutely. Incredibly important. I mean, Shonda Rhimes is, she's a singular figure in the industry. I mean, a woman of color, which is almost unheard of, having not one but two or three shows that she runs. In fact, she controls Thursday night on ABC. So I mean, it's amazing to have someone of her stature and her power to actually come out publicly. All too often, people of color and women are hesitant to speak out in the industry because they're worried about their next job, whether they're going to be hired, they're going to be put on some blacklist that's kind of unspoken. So it's really courageous for her to do that, and I think she can do that because she is such a commodity.
Exactly.
But not many people can, and lots of people feel the way she does, but they just can't voice that feeling publicly.
And part of that is the fact that this is an industry that is based on personal social networking.
Absolutely.
Rather than on, necessarily strictly open hiring.
Sure.
So people do have to be very careful about the bridges that they burn. But one other actor who may not have the leverage and stature yet that Shonda Rhimes does, but who was pretty open, was Kevin Hart, partly because he was also mentioned
He's actually doing pretty well at the box office. So.
Yes, that's true. That's true, and is definitely very up and coming. So Kevin Hart, whose name came up in these email exchanges, executives called him a word that means prostitute, right? I'll use the more PC term, to which Hart responded instantly on social media, quote, "Knowing your self-worth is extremely important, people. I worked extremely hard to get where I am today." Is this a case of a black actor being seen as, quote, uppity by these executives? Like, the fact that he is actually daring to ask for payment and compensation that he feels he's worthy of.
Sure. I can't remember who said it, but I think it's true that in general, talent is somewhat looked down upon by executives in these positions. They're kind of seen as the enemy in a way. We're looking at the bottom line. We're trying to make money, and they're demanding these huge salaries and a cut of the profits, that type of thing. So I think all actors get that to some degree. However, actors of color, I think, are singled out for special attention in this regard because from the very beginning, their worth isn't seen as commensurate with that of their white peers. Right. So, they're going to be kind of the butt of these types of comments, I think, more than your other A-listers who happen to be white and male. So I think they all get it to some degree.
So what have you made of the responses by Amy Pascal, Scott Rudin, and others, Sony executives, having seen, their email exchanges being exposed and critical media coverage? Of course, some have responded saying that the media should never have published a bunch of sensitive information. Some of it was sensitive. For example, the information of employees, the personal information, which has been terribly devastating. And you can, low-level employees at Sony don't deserve that. But at the same time, it has been really instructive to see these conversations between the top executives exposed, but they have tried to backpedal now.
Yeah. Well, I think it was important for the media to cover this. I mean, this is an important story. I mean, diversity in the industry or lack thereof is an important story. For many of the reasons you point out in your introduction about the role that the media play in our society, in terms of how we think about people, particularly when we don't have firsthand experiences with them. All of our implicit biases, our stereotypes, our perceptions and misperceptions are often a function of what we watch. One of the things we know from media research is that, immigrants to this country, for example, come to this country already with predispositions and ideas about groups that have circulated in the films and TV shows they've seen. They've traveled around the world. So this is a very powerful industry. I mean, they'd like to think about it as just entertainment, but it's a lot more than entertainment. So I think that Pascal and others had to kind of try to distance themselves from these remarks and to say that these were aberrations, things that were never meant to be seen publicly, and of course they weren't. Although it's kind of beyond me how you put these things in email these days when you know that this stuff is vulnerable. But they almost have to distance themselves from that and try to make amends because it's not, in 2014, something that you want to have out in the public sphere.
Pascal met with the Reverend Al Sharpton and the National Urban League around the issue of diversity in Hollywood, and Sharpton pointed out that there were no major executives in this industry who were black. Is he right to point that out? Yeah,
well, absolutely. I mean, there are a few names, but they're a handful. I mean, we've done hundreds of interviews with people in the industry as part of the background research for our study. And one of the things we know is that, you can count on one hand the people who, have any type of green lighting authority, who can actually make a decision and to, determine a budget, a bottom line for a project. So that kind of sets up this whole chain of events whereby, the projects that are made have a particular look, or when they do include people of color, they're marketed in a particular way. That it's almost like glass ceilings and other types of employment that limits the potential for these projects.
The other issue with email discussions being exposed was over Denzel Washington. Michael Linton's email exchanges at Sony when they were interested in casting him for The Equalizer. The movie is out now, and he was cast as a male lead. So this sort of archived email, one of the things that was said was, quote, "I believe that the international motion picture audience is racist. In general, pictures with an African-American lead don't play well overseas." Is that true? Is the world such a racist place compared to the United States that they wouldn't be interested in seeing a film with Denzel Washington?
That's a myth that has justified a lot of the action and inaction in the industry as it relates to film.
And we should just mention that these major motion picture companies are relying on a significant portion of their revenue coming from an international audience these days.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's where the argument kind of
Right.
the rubber hits the road. I mean, they make the point that we make most of or a lot of our money in global box office. One of the things we're looking at in our study is we're looking at domestic versus global box office, trying to see, what the patterns are as it relates to diversity in the bottom line. And lo and behold, what we found in the 2014 study that looked at the 2011 season was that films that roughly reflected the diversity of American society were the ones that on average did the best. So that kind of dispels that point right there. And there are examples of films like Fast Five, for example, that made a huge amount of money, that was directed by, an Asian American man, and that had, a number of different minorities in lead roles in the film, and did incredibly well overseas. So,
I mean, surprise, surprise, the rest of the world wants films that look like them too.
Well, the rest of the world is very diverse. I mean, so I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What it really does, it points to kind of a 40-year-old mentality, or a 40-year mentality is rooted in 40 years ago, in terms of how films are marketed. I mean, markets aren't really tapped that are very lucrative, that are just screaming for diverse images, that they just don't want to go outside the box to promote.
I mean, I grew up outside the United States, and the main sort of pop culture ambassadors from the U.S. that I was exposed to: Bill Cosby, Eddie Murphy, Michael Jackson, and these were considered huge influences in the Middle East and South Asia, and still are today. Latin America, you really see that, and it's remarkable that this would be touted today at a time, and especially with somebody like Denzel Washington. He's not a new actor, he's a veteran of the industry. Now, so this idea that if movie and TV studios don't feature straight white males in the lead or among the main cast, if that doesn't happen, people won't go to the movies and they won't turn a profit. How much of a myth is that, and how much do we know from box office numbers about profits? You alluded to it earlier.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is we don't have that many examples of diverse films with diverse leads that are marketed that we can use to say, aha, here we go, here's the evidence. Well, Fast Five is a great example of a film that made an incredible amount of money domestically and globally, and was an incredibly diverse film. And they're up to Fast 7 now or something, whatever. I mean, I've lost track, but it's making a lot of money. So the fact that you have at least that one example shows that there are possibilities. What we're really talking about is an industry that is incredibly lucrative, and the people in the industry make an incredible amount of money. We're talking about self-fulfilling prophecies. It's an industry that basically creates stars. Stars aren't born, they're created. So if you're already starting with a white male-dominated industry that's kind of anointing white males as the most viable entities, well, in the future, you're going to reproduce that reality. And you're going to continue to have white males in the lead, and they're going to be the ones that are going to make money overseas. They're going to be the icons that are created by the industry machine. And so you pretty much guarantee that they're going to have the place at the table and no one else will. There's nothing inherent in white maleness that sort of travels overseas and nothing else works. I mean, that's just not true. In fact, quite the opposite is true. People want to see their own experiences in people who look like them in these lead roles.
Absolutely. I can attest to that personally. Let's step back and examine Hollywood in general. The report that your department releases regularly is a tremendous report analyzing. Obviously, there's a ton of data to analyze. Tell us about the Hollywood Diversity Report and how you even approach it. What are some of the things you're looking for?
Well, it's a project that was a long time in the making. I've worked on this issue for about 20 years. I've done work for the Writers Guild. I do the Hollywood Writers Report for them periodically. I've also done some work for the Screen Actors Guild. And what I know as a sociologist is that the things we're talking about in 2014 are the things we've been talking about for decades. I mean, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in the late 70s did a number of studies on diversity or the lack thereof in the industry. They came back to L.A. after the 1992 uprisings to basically say, well, what has changed? Because there was some concern that The uprisings, to some degree, may have been exacerbated, I guess, by images that were circulating about different communities in LA. And so, I worked as a staffer with the commission when they came to LA in '93. And we went all over the industry, and lo and behold, we found statistics that looked strikingly like 1978. Well, here we are in 2014. Meanwhile, America has gotten more and more diverse. The industry's gotten a little bit better. We have some examples, but guess what? The gap is bigger now between where the industry is and where the emerging America is. America is becoming more diverse more quickly than the industry is. So, the report is an attempt to give us a bird's eye view of where we are with diversity. It's the largest report of its type. Like I said, I've looked at this stuff for 20 years. We try to look at every arena, behind the camera, in front of the camera, and not just a sample. We're looking at everything. So we looked at over 1,000 TV shows.
Wow.
Believe it or not, there are that many.
Wow.
On cable and broadcast, scripted, unscripted, reality, news, talk, sitcoms, dramas, you name it. Digital platforms, we looked at all of that.
So even shows that are purely online?
Well, Netflix. I mean, not web series. I mean, we can have a whole other discussion about that. But I'm very interested in that, actually, as sort of an alternative, basically demonstrating the degree to which the mainstream is not supplying what the audience wants. So people are doing it themselves,
Right. So Netflix movies,
Netflix,
and there's one
Hulu,
that I want to discuss.
Amazon, and then of course we also look at ratings, because we want to kind of tie this to the bottom line, since the industry claims that that's what motivates its decisions. It couldn't possibly be racism, So we look at that, and this new study, we're actually releasing the second installment in February 2015, the 2015 Hollywood Diversity Report. We're going to do a content analysis, so we're going to start looking at images. So we'll be getting into kind of, okay, the shows that are quote-unquote diverse, what are those diverse images? So we looked at hours and hours of programming that we sampled, we coded, and that'll be part of the 2015 study.
So then let's turn to what you have found in general. I mean, if you're looking at different arenas, you're looking at network TV, you're looking at cable TV, you're looking at film. Are there differences in general? Well, let's just look at, for example, how women are portrayed first. Women, suffer from being cast in very, very limited roles. They're either sexualized, they are, either they're white. If they're not white, then they're sexualized. If they're not sexualized, then they're, there's so few roles for women. So how does the representation of women fare?
Well, unfortunately, the first study we did, the 2014 diversity report, was only an employment study. So we really only looked at credits, essentially. Who was behind the camera, who was in front. So we couldn't really get into the details of the representations themselves. That's going to change for the 2015 study. We're going to actually look at that. But what you stated earlier, kind of that overview, is more or less what the literature tells us. We know that women are marginalized in terms of the types of roles they're allowed to play. Their relationship to men often defining much of what we see of women on the screen. So those things.
I mean, they're just foils for men, essentially. It's so rare to actually see, for example, two women interacting with one another on screen when they're not talking about a man.
The Bechdel Test.
Referring to the Bechdel Test by Alison Bechdel. A very narrow and limiting test. And all it is the film must have at least two women characters who talk to one another about something other than a man.
Yeah.
How many
films?
Low bar. And how many films fail this very low bar?
More than half of films fail that bar. I mean, at least in the past. I mean, I guess moving forward, we'll have to look at that. And that's one of the things that's important about our study. I mean, we're going to look at this every year, so we'll have a longitudinal study. We'll be able to see if we're making progress, whether we're treading water or whether we're going backwards. Too often we have snapshots, and we don't really know where we are in motion. That's what we're trying to change with this ongoing study.
And I'm assuming those details on the representation of people of color is also coming up in February?
Oh, huge, yeah. And that's the major part of it, actually.
Right.
I mean, we look at women and people of color, but there's sort of a special focus on people of color because there's so few studies that kind of really look at that comprehensively.
We'll have to have you back on in February to discuss that. My guest is Darnell Hunt. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Well, it is the holiday season, and I know many of you might be making plans to go and watch movies in theaters. So we're having a discussion today on our program, a wide-ranging discussion on how women and people of color are portrayed in film and on television. My guest is Darnell Hunt. He is the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. So we were talking about, Darnell, about the issue of the representation of women and people of color, but we often restrict our discussions to the cast and a little bit to the producers and the directors and the executives and the screenwriters. But there's also a huge set of employees that work, quote, below the line. And for people who are not familiar with the industry, this is a way, this is everybody else, the camera operators, the lighting folks, etc. And in the city of Los Angeles, home of Hollywood, where there is an enormous amount of diversity, one of the most diverse cities in the country. How diverse is the below-the-line, employment in this industry?
Well, unfortunately, our study hasn't been able to focus on that yet, although we hope to in one of the future studies. But what I know from, again, anecdotal data, IATSE, one of the major unions that represents, film workers, the folks who do lighting and gaffers and many of these different positions behind the scenes, basically, is overwhelmingly white and male. I mean, so much so. I mean, worse than with creative talent, which is pretty bad itself. In fact, we've heard all kinds of anecdotal stories about nooses being hung. I mean, things being done to intimidate workers who were attempting to encroach upon, essentially the province rather of white men who dominate these positions. All too often, you have these conflicts of interest within these craft unions. On the one hand, they represent workers against management, trying to get higher wages, better job conditions, that type of thing. But the unions also talk about diversity and the importance of diversity, which is almost like a conflict of interest in a way, because the members who are already working, who are part of the union, see that as, again, undermining their position. So it's a very difficult position for these unions, and at least behind the scenes, it's the dark ages. We haven't made any progress at all in terms of opening it up to people of color.
Now, we referred earlier to some progress that has been made, since the 70s, a little as it is. But, we do, for example, on network TV, it seems, just anecdotally, it seems as though we're seeing a more diverse sphere than ever before. I'm thinking of Modern Family, Scandal, Shonda Rhimes' show, The Mindy Project, Blackish, this new film on ABC, New Girl. How does network television fare when it comes to on-screen diversity compared to, say, cable or film?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag.
And do the vast majority of other shows sort of dilute the effect of some of these top shows?
Well, that's a great question, and something we'll be able to answer with our data. See, we're always about a year and a half behind in our study because we have to wait for a season to complete, and then we have a tremendous amount of data, like 100,000 cells in the spreadsheet, if you can imagine it. And then it takes months to kind of clean that data and produce it. So we're going to be looking at 2012-13 in the 2015 report, that season. So we haven't even gotten to the season with Blackish and some of these other new shows that came out this year. But again, anecdotally, my sense is that, ABC, one of our sponsors, by the way, for this project, which I can talk to you more about in terms of sort of how this report came about, has been talking to us for about a year or so about diversity and kind of what they're trying to do internally. And so I think they took a major step forward with some of the new shows they released this year. Whether or not that reflects a sea change in terms of industry thinking is another thing. I'm not sure that everyone else has followed suit yet, and whether our aggregate statistics are going to show a huge bump just because of these few shows. It's possible, but my sense right now is that there hasn't been enough of a change elsewhere that the overall numbers are going to be all that different.
And will taking such a step by a network make it a more lucrative entity? Again, there's the question of profitability.
Well, one thing we know about the industry is that nothing sort of is copied more than success. So when you have a hit, everyone's scrambling to try to reproduce that hit. So hopefully, the fact that Blackish is doing well, How to Get Away with Murder is doing well, and the ratings will lead to other shows like that. I mean, it's a shame that we have to copy things that are successful as opposed to coming up with new creative ideas that reflect the range of experiences we have, but that's just the way the industry has worked thus far.
Right. And you would think cable might do a better job than network TV. They don't have as many legal restrictions on them. There seems to be more freedom, or at least that's the impression the rest of us get. But then you think of, for example, the very highly lauded HBO show Girls by Lena Dunham, everyone's favorite feminist, it seems this day. Hardly a person of color in the show, certainly not a single in the main cast. How can you have a show set in New York without a single person of color in the main cast? I mean, great for women, lots of, women-run show, women-written show, all white women.
Well, if it were the first time that we had that, I would be surprised, but it's not. We have lots of shows set in very diverse places where the cast just happens to be all white. I mean, they do it all the time. It's very unfortunate. Girls is really white girls, but, it could have been... missed opportunity is what I call it. I mean, there are ways they could have made the show very interesting and accessible to broader audiences had they just expanded the story. Part of the problem is, if you look at the writers' rooms that produce these shows, the shows are largely a reflection of the experience that's collectively around the table. So I haven't looked at the writing staff for Girls, but I can be pretty assured that it's probably close to 100% white, if not 100% white. And I know it's largely female, which is unusual because we typically have male-dominated writing rooms, so that's good. But if they had some women of color in the room, I think it would have made for a completely different show that could have, sort of built upon the success that it's currently having and made it more accessible to more women, I think.
Now, you mentioned that your study also looked at Netflix, which people are increasingly turning to for their media consumption, their pop culture consumption. The show Orange is the New Black made waves. Some people think it's an excellent example of how to bring in diverse casts. Others think that yet another show that...
Stereotypes.
Yeah, there's lots of stereotypes, and we're using the vehicle of a white woman's story to tell the stories of women of color. Do you have any opinions, one way or another, on Orange is the New Black?
I watched the show, and I like the show, but I'm sensitive to those critiques. I mean, I think to some degree it is. I mean, Gingy Cohan, the executive producer, a woman who did Weeds, the show before, had a number of successful shows on cable, and in this case on Netflix.
But even Weeds, I mean, a show that did have some people of color, major stereotypes.
It was the white woman's story.
Right, the Latino drug kingpins, and, right.
But that, again, underscores the point I made earlier about why it's so important to have people of color in decision-making positions, to have them as the executive producer, showrunner, which is a whole discussion we haven't had yet. I mean, the statistics there are horrible. But basically, they're going to tell their story, or they're going to tell a story they're familiar with. Even if it's a diverse cast, it's going to be told through the eyes of the white protagonist. If it's a white person as showrunner, it's very rare that you break out of that mode, and that's why it's so important to have people of color in those decision-making positions.
And so, before we get to that, then it's actually not shocking that a person would write about experiences that they can, reflect on from their own lives, or if they're writing for people of color, their own stereotypes of what they think people of color are experiencing.
Well, that's exactly the point, and I make that point in all my writing. I mean, it's not like people of color, or rather, white writers can't write about people of color or situations that involve people of color, but they're never going to tell the same story that the person of color would have told, because they're going to see it through a different lens, they're going to have a different perspective, different cultural sensibilities, and I think art is richer when we have more of that rather than less of that, and unfortunately in Hollywood we have less of that pretty much all the time.
So tell us what you mean by showrunners and why that is the sort of bottleneck where a lot of these decisions get made.
Well, basically what happens in Hollywood and television, movies are a little different, but in television, you have a creator who essentially has an idea, a premise for a show, who pitches it to a network or to a production company that's associated with the network, and that idea is either bought or it's passed upon. And depending upon the stature of that person, that is to say whether they're seasoned or not, or have a track record or credibility, like Shonda Rhimes, who can pretty much, everyone's scrambling to hear her pitches because everything she touches turns to gold. There are people like that who of course, have entree and can pitch ideas, and they often become what's called the showrunner. That is to say, the executive producer. And there are lots of executive producers. If you look at credits of shows, you might see 8 or 9 people who are labeled executive producer, but only 1 or 2 of them is the showrunner. And that person is the person who is actually responsible for the day-to-day production of the show. All the hiring, they hire the writers, they make all of those types of
They sign off.
decisions. And they're the one who is in direct contractual relationship with the network to get this thing done week by week so that it can air. And so basically they're calling the shots, and they are putting their stamp on what the show will be. They're the ones who can say, if the writers come up with the script, I don't like this, take it back, work on it some more, and so forth and so on. The buck stops with them, basically. So they have a tremendous amount of power over the look of a show, whose story it's going to be, the story arc, the character arcs, the whole bit. So there's so few people of color in those positions, and women of color. Shonda Rhimes is pretty much it. There've been a couple over the years. But just so few that it's shocking,
right?
Given what America looks like.
And where are the Latino women, the Asian women,
Absolutely.
or men?
Absolutely.
We talked about Netflix earlier. Netflix is pushing a new film that's supposed to be this major epic called Marco Polo, that The Atlantic described as, quote, full of ludicrous Orientalist stereotypes and privileging the white Western point of view. Right. Steve Carell was involved in a project called Pyongyang, which because of the Sony hacking scandal has also been indefinitely shelved. I think probably a good idea. I haven't seen the film, but I can only imagine what it would be. Even the network TV show How I Met Your Mother recently came under fire for this very crass representation of Asians in one of its episodes. How deep is this the stereotyping? Because it's particularly of Asian women, where they're sort of cast as these submissive, sexualized playthings for usually white men. It's pretty vile.
Yeah. And then of course Asian men are sexless,
or they're kung fu fighters,
right. These stereotypes run deep. They have been around for generations, and again, the thing we know about stereotypes is that the stereotypes really tell us more about the person who created it and used it than the people who are the target of the stereotype. And essentially what they do is they're empowering the people who use them. They're telling jokes at the expense of the other person to make themselves feel better. The same is true with African American stereotypes. They were really about valorizing whiteness for the most part. So what you have to do when you look at these stereotypes is kind of look at the political agenda. Where is it coming from? What is the intent of the stereotype? Why is it quote unquote funny in situation comedies? Two Broke Girls had this Asian American character who again was the butt of jokes throughout the entire run of the show. It's just very common. Now again, imagine if the writers' room had a requisite number of Asian American either women or men. Probably wouldn't happen that way.
And one of the few South Asian women who has now developed some cachet in Hollywood is the woman who runs the Mindy Project.
Right.
And this is certainly Mindy Kaling, whose character in the TV show Mindy Lahiri is definitely defying stereotypes. And in general, sort of South Asian representation on our screens is the nerd, the Big Bang Theory's character, or the convenience store owner, and some of those also fall into Arab stereotypes, and we can have a whole discussion on Arab stereotypes. Latinos and are perpetually stereotyped in Hollywood. In Los Angeles, where the Latino population is the plurality now. But they are the maids, gardeners, and cooks is all that they are depicted as. How problematic is that?
It's very problematic. We have a few exceptions. Desperate Housewives, those characters. But again, the disconnect is so huge between where we are demographically and what we see on the screen in terms of the types of depictions that it's almost laughable. It's kind of hard to, imagine, this coming out of LA, as you pointed out earlier, which is one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse city in America. But again, it's a function of the way the industry is structured. Who's making the decisions, and we're talking about white men for the most part. Their experiences, what they find comforting, interesting, and amusing, And that kind of shapes what we see on the screen.
I want to quote the acclaimed writer and producer Legia Villalobos, who responded to the Sony hack. She said, "I will not get hired by any of these people, but I think it's important to call them out on it." She directed the Sundance selected film Under the Same Moon, and she represents this sort of growing group of independent filmmakers who are saying, well, if Hollywood refuses to tell our stories and allow us to tell our own stories, we're going to do it ourselves.
Right, absolutely.
How much influence is the independent film industry having on Hollywood in a way that might be really threatening the relevance of Hollywood?
Well, that's a great point. I was on a panel with Ava DuVernay about a year and a half ago, and this is well before Selma, was sort of
she's incredible,
being talked about, and that was her position. I mean, she's like, look, I've been at this for a long time. The industry is not interested in telling the stories I want to tell, so I'll tell it myself.
And just to mention Ava DuVernay's film Selma out in theaters, an incredible film about the civil rights movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So. So her background was in marketing, and she set out to singularly disprove the myth about these types of films not doing well overseas. And her argument was basically that they're not putting the marketing resources behind the films. They're not tapping the networks that are hungry. They're hungry for these types of films. So I know how to do that, and I'll do that independently. And of course she got I guess this major deal with Selma. Again, demonstrating that you can tell these types of stories and critically acclaimed and will probably do really well at the box office. I guess we'll have to follow and see how it does. But yeah, I mean, it's like the point we made earlier about web productions, filling a gap that's not being met by the Hollywood industry. Well, I think the same thing is happening with independent filmmakers. And the industry had better wake up. I mean, that's kind of the message from our reports that it's just not sustainable, to do business the way they're doing it, given where America is and where it's going.
So let's take a look at some of the movies that our viewers, our audience, listeners might encounter in the theaters this holiday season. Exodus, a film by Ridley Scott about the sort of the heyday of the Egyptian Empire. Ridley Scott came under fire for casting essentially all white actors in the lead in a film set in historic Egypt, and all of the lesser characters, the slaves, the thieves, of course, were people of color. And he justified his decision. Again, I can't mount a film of this budget where I have to rely on tax rebates in Spain and say that my lead actor is Muhammad so-and-so from such and such. End of quote.
Right. Well, it's the same argument, it just sort of reproduces the status quo. It's what we've seen for years. I mean, it's almost like we're back in the 50s looking at
are we supposed to believe that all of these characters in ancient Egypt had white skin? Are we supposed to believe that they're Egyptian?
Well, look at the debate over King Tut and what King Tut looked like. I mean, this is an ongoing debate. The Mideast and Africa. The upper end of Africa, Northern Africa. I mean, these are ongoing debates where the origins of civilizations and the role of people of African descent have been disputed for decades. And so you would kind of expect to see in a Hollywood machinery that's led by white men that these types of images would hold sway. So I'm not surprised.
And then there's The Hobbit, the last in the Hobbit trilogy that also was just released, where both women and people of color are woefully underrepresented. I mean, certainly to the credit of the filmmakers, they didn't have much to work with, given that Tolkien's original books pretty much featured white men in. I mean, he didn't specify they were white, but the assumption was, his.
Well, white is the default category, right?
Right.
Race is not mentioned.
His mythology based on whatever medieval England, or not even medieval, even before that, ancient England. And they did do a little bit better with representing women. I think inserting some female characters into the film, but. It's assumed that the audiences for this film are going to be largely white, but I don't think that's true. I mean, for my own, I like Tolkien.
Well, if they continue to kind of produce films in this way, they probably will succeed in having audiences that are mainly white, and they're not going to make the money that they would have made otherwise, because they're going to turn off audiences of color and audiences with women. So.
And then there's Annie. So let's talk about one of the maybe bright spots in the series of films, the remake of this beloved musical feature, with Quvenzhané Wallis as Annie, Jamie Foxx as the politician Will Stacks. How important is it for kids, particularly who are the primary audience for this film, to see Quvenzhané Wallis as Annie?
That's essential. I mean, one of the reasons, and I do some consulting for children's programming, and one of the reasons that children's programming is so scrutinized and regulated is because we know that these images have an impact on the development of children. And when children don't see people like themselves represented, they start to, resent who they are. I mean, the famous doll test, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, points to the amazing impact that images and perceptions have on children and their development of self-esteem. So, I mean, it's important to see a young black girl who looks like a black girl, in a lead role like this in a film, regardless of how good the film is. I've heard mixed reviews in terms of the actual quality of the film, but it's important to have those representations.
And isn't it also important for white children to feel like they can relate to children of color in how it informs their approaches to life?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think that white children, like children of color, need to see a diverse environment depicted. They need to know how to work together with other people. They need to respect other people's cultures and not assume that they are the stereotype that we all too often see. So that's important.
And we know from studies of implicit biases that children of color, in particular black children, are often perceived as less innocent, less able to feel pain, older than their actual age. This is perception. And so and how much of a role does Hollywood play on people's implicit biases? I mean, it's tempting to think that the industry influences our relations with one another completely. Is it overstating it?
Well, how much time do we have? I mean, there's a huge literature on media effects and the impact media have on the way we think, who we are, how we see ourselves, the whole bit. Probably the strongest finding that's reproduced over and over again in the literature is that the media tend to set the agenda. So things we see in the media a lot are the things that we talk about, that we think about. So when we see certain types of stories and experiences presented continually, they're things that tend to rise to the top of the agenda in terms of public discourse. When things are omitted, when they're absent, then they become less important and they're minimized. And so we have problems like race and racism, for example, that we don't see them depicted, so we believe that everything's okay. And so there are all these interesting studies of the Cosby Show, for example, from the 80s that talked about its role and sort of almost being duped into supporting an enlightened racism of that period that was very much in line with where President Reagan's political agenda was going as it related to race. It was unintentional, of course, because they thought they were doing something different, but in fact that was the unintended
Sanford
consequence. Yeah, and those shows, I mean, they were kind of reacting to those shows from the 70s and trying to do something different to quote unquote recode blackness. So, to get back to your original question, I mean, it's absolutely key that we have these images that work to dispel the myths, because the media, while it's hard to quantify because of all the other influences in the world that aren't just media focused, they do have an impact on how we think and what we think of as normal. Media have a normalizing function. The more we see it in the media, the more we take it for granted, basically.
And one of the things that didn't come up, but I feel like that Hollywood has done a little bit better on is the depiction of the LGBT community. And it seems, I mean, just again, totally anecdotally, I don't know if your
starting
studies
from zero,
looked at that.
I mean,
Right. But we
yeah.
see now gay and lesbian characters are a lot more prominent today than I think they ever were just in the last few years.
Oh, absolutely. With marriage equality and everything else. I mean, it's an issue that's on the agenda in ways that just wasn't in the past. And things that couldn't be spoken, that were said implicitly or assumed, are now out front in the open.
Right, just to see two people of the same gender kissing one another on screen is something that's become now more normalized. And it's an interesting way, and I'm wondering if that, the increasing push by Hollywood to normalize the LGBT community, in quotes, and the resulting success of some of the political fights of the LGBT community, whether those go hand in hand, and couldn't we see something similar happen with the civil rights of people of color?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I forget who said this, but I think it's true. Hollywood always lags behind the general society. I mean, they're always, particularly when you have white men who are making a lot of these decisions, very cautious about what they think the audience wants, and often they have no clue really what the audience wants, and they're using seat of the pants judgment that's just not rooted in any real fact or data. And so they make decisions that mimic kind of what they see in the headlines, and they see the headlines as kind of an indicator of where the public is going. So the fact that we're seeing more LGBT representations today, I think, is pretty much a reflection of what's happening politically in this country around questions of gender and sexuality. So this is an issue that, again, points to the fact that it's more than just entertainment. It really does have a lot to do with the quality of our lives and the way we think of ourselves and think of other people, and ultimately our political choices.
Now, finally, Darnell Hunt, in light of the Ferguson uprising against police brutality, which is sort of a good backdrop for our entire discussion today, something fundamental has changed in American politics since this summer. And that change and how it plays out is something we'll continue to see unfold because it's still very early on in what seems to be a new and emerging movement. How important are these discussions at this time, at this political moment in the U.S., and is Hollywood taking note?
Well, are they taking note? I hope they are. I mean, you know, one of the reasons that we reached out to the industry for support for our report, we wanted them to read our report. We didn't want to just produce an academic report that was going to sit on a shelf somewhere. So part of the deal is, for our corporate sponsors, we had meetings with their executives to kind of go over the report line by line, and in some cases they'll ask us to run a company-specific report. Okay, to pull all our shows out and look at them in relation to the overall report to see how we're doing. And I think that's been powerful. I mean, I've heard, again, anecdotally, that discussions are happening around the water cooler now at some of these networks that just hadn't happened in decades because of our report and the way we're working with them. So,
and perhaps because of what they're reading in the newspaper.
And so we're hoping we're going to do everything we can to connect the dots between our report and things that are happening in the broader world, like Ferguson, like Eric Garner, et cetera. But I think and
some of the immigration struggles.
Well, absolutely. I think all of these things are clearly connected, and they all point to kind of dispelling of kind of these notions of a post-racial America, like because of Obama that race doesn't matter now, which is ludicrous. I mean, race in some way matters more now after his election. So,
right.
But that belief is very powerful. I mean, it was part of a bargain, I think, that voters struck when some of these white voters voted for Obama.
Right.
This is a way to kind of solve our conscience and get beyond race and in one fell swoop do away with centuries of racial and other types of oppression, which in fact are continuing to run rampant. So I think the fact that we get peeks into what's really going on from time to time, and these things become crises, it reminds us, well, those of us who already know, but those who don't know, that we have an amazing amount of work to do.
Well, Darnell Hunt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My guest has been Darnell Hunt. He's a sociology professor and the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer, and our program director, Anna Buss, our media intern, is sitting in for Bipasha today. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Christian Beck is our production intern, and Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful holiday season. We've got a number of programs lined up for you, and the next live show will be December 31st.